Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast is my friend Hannah Russell, joining us from Cincinnati, Ohio. Welcome to the podcast, Hannah.
Hi.
Hannah's going to share her story being asexual, and I'll let her define that at some point. We've done very few podcasts with asexual guests. I think we've done one in the 700 podcasts we've done, and I'm so glad that Hannah, a friend of Hannah, kind of reached out and wondered if you'd be on the podcast, and I'm so glad. Let me tell you a little bit about Hannah. She grew up in the Seattle area for the most part. She gradually made her way through education all the way to become a PhD. That's what took her to Cincinnati, where her and her husband live. So she's really Dr. Hannah Russell. Will you tell our listeners, because I want to get straight, what your PhD in is really cool. Tell our listeners, because I'll kind of botch it. Tell our listeners what your PhD is focused on.
Yeah. So as I said, it sounds much fancier than it is, but I have a PhD in pathobiology and molecular medicine. So sometimes we'll say I have a doctorate in medicine, but I am not a doctor of medicine. So we study the science of diseases and of treating diseases. So essentially, we try to understand what is happening on a very base level in a disease process and how can we treat that better than we currently are. So it sounds much fancier than it is, but that's
It's really
what it
cool.
is.
Respect for what you've done from a professional standpoint. To have a PhD,
Thank you.
you're in your early 30s. I may have mentioned you're a mom of 3 daughters, 5, 2.5,
Mhm.
and 10 months. So you're busy and you've got a lot
I
going
am
on.
busy.
And
Yeah.
Hannah's going to talk about why someone that's asexual would even talk about that, why there's a need for that. But I think our hope is that, and I think Hannah's doing this out of love, is just if there's other people that are asexual or have never heard a story about somebody like them that are wondering if there's anybody like them or there's hope in my future, I think our joint prayers, Hannah's story, will give you hope. Or if you have an
Mhm.
asexual friend, you'll have better insights into the road that he or she is walking. And
Yeah.
And just this is part of my feeling of creating Zion and gathering Israel is just there's people that are, I don't quite know the language is sometimes used, but just not in the majority and are sexual minorities or
Yeah.
gender minorities, or assuming asexual fits in one of those two buckets.
It
And
does.
just so before I stick my foot in my mouth too much, listeners,
No.
I will turn it over to Hannah to share her story.
Sure. And like you said, it's my hope is that um I can share the story that maybe I wish I would have had when I was a teenager. So kind of just to first describe what even asexuality is, because when I tell people that, sometimes they'll say like, you're not an asexually reproducing organism, like you're a human. What are you talking about?" And so, not asexual in the science definition of, asexually reproducing organisms. That's not what it is. The way I describe it is that if you consider straight people to be attracted to the opposite sex, so heterosexual people are attracted to the opposite sex, homosexual people are attracted to the same sex, asexual people are not attracted. They're not attracted to the same sex, they're not attracted to the opposite sex. Um, so they just don't experience sexual attraction at all. Um, and it's called the asexual spectrum because you get people that they're not attracted, period, the end. And then you get people, it's on the asexual spectrum, it's called demisexual, where they aren't attracted sexually, but if they met somebody that they developed a really deep emotional relationship with them, they might develop a sexual attraction to that person specifically. They'd still not be attracted in general, but after a while, they might be like, actually, that person
Hmm.
I am attracted to, but only after a period of time. There's also people that are gray sexual that like they might some days feel attracted, but on the general, they don't. Um, I really am pretty much on the far end of asexual. It's not, I'm, I'm not really sexually attracted. There's also levels of repulsion. So asexual people, they'll say, I'm asexual, and then they'll say their level of repulsion. Um, Asexual people can also be called ace. So if I say ace, that's just short for asexual. Um, but repulsion, you have people that are sex repulsed. So not only are people not sexually attractive to them, but the entire concept of sex is repulsive to them. They don't want to think about it. It's gross. The idea of you having sex with anybody else is absolutely repulsive. Um, then you have people that are sex neutral, which is it's neither repulsive nor appealing. When I'm explaining it to people, I might say I'm golf neutral, right? I understand there's people that love to go golfing. I don't, but it's not, it's, some people like it and that's fine. If someone's like, let's go golfing, I'll be like, don't really want to, but sure, why not? But it's neither here nor there to me if somebody else wants to. And I wouldn't hate doing it. I just wouldn't want to do it. Then there are people that are called sex positive, which is they may even like the actual act of sex itself, but they're still not attracted. There's no direction to that um, impulse. So it's really just an itch they want to scratch, if that makes sense. um, then the last thing, kind of like for terminology, is there's split attractions, which is really important to understanding asexuality. And actually, everyone has split attractions, just usually they match. So, split attraction is the idea that you can be sexually attracted or romantically attracted. And for most people, they match. So if you're heterosexual, you're probably actually saying you're heterosexual, heteroromantic. So you're attracted to making sexual and romantic relationships with the opposite sex. People with asexuality, it's actually not uncommon for those things to not match. So for me, I'm asexual, but I'm heteroromantic. I am romantically attracted to men. I am not sexually attracted to them. And I would say probably the most common is um to be asexual, aromantic. So they might like to have friendships with other people. They might even like really deep platonic friendships, but they don't want romance with them. But many asexual people have a split attraction. And I've had people say, if you're not asexual, aromantic, probably the most common is asexual panromantic, which is you like romantic relationships. Sex is not really important. Like what gender they are is not important. You just want romantic relationships. And I've had people ask me, are you sure that your heteroromanticism is not just because you were raised in a heteronormative church, that you wanted romantic relationships? And so you said, well, I want them with men, obviously. Um, Maybe, I don't know. It's possible that I am heteroromantic because even though I was not sexually attracted, I was romantically attracted. And so in my brain, I only envisioned romantic relationships with men. I don't know, but um, they are different for a lot of people. And that's important, I think, to understand that. Because I think asexual people are very rare, to be honest. Um, there's not a large asexual community. In the asexual community, there's a joke that the number of asexual people on Earth is roughly the size of the population of Denmark. And so there's a joke that we're going to take over Denmark someday because we're just as big as they are. That's our joke. But
That's awesome.
um, but that's about how many people there are in the world that are asexual, which isn't that many. Um, But when we do get represented, there's, especially in literature or movies, if there's asexual people, they're usually cold, they're usually calculating, they're usually feelingless.
Hmm.
And so I think one of the things to understand about asexual people is many of us have romantic relationships, and those that don't have very deep friendships. We are very feeling people. The only thing that asexual people don't have is sexual attraction. Um, but with that, I was going to kind of talk a little bit about my life story and um, how I got to where I am now. And I think the first thing is um, everyone, I think, not everyone, many people talk about their crushes growing up. And I was very confused when I was a child about what crushes were. I didn't get it. And I remember in first grade, kindergarten, first grade, there would be boys that had crushes on me or whatever. And I remember my family would kind of lightheartedly tease me about them. And I remember getting really bothered and just almost mad that they were, teasing me about these crushes. And of course, at the time, they would tease me and say that I was being defensive, that like, "Oh, you do like him." And it was like, "No, I'm just I feel unheard right now," is, what I was really saying is I don't know what you're talking about. Like, what does that even mean? and And then I did get a few crushes, but they were different looking back. So the first crush I remember was when I was in 5th grade. And like if you ask me today, I don't have a great mind's eye. It's hard for me to picture people's faces in general. But if you ask me what he looked like, I can't tell you. I think he had brown hair. I don't know. But that was not at all what I was attracted to in him. I remember he was a bully defender, the kids that would like defend other kids from bullies. And I remember the day that I really liked him. In 5th grade, I had this PE teacher who he was really mean and he was bullying me because I am bad about anything that involves like hand-eye coordination. I can't catch very well. That's not who I am. And we were playing baseball. And I kept on like missing the ball entirely. And he he was bullying me and I get my third strike and I'm like, "Okay, great. I can go sit down. I've struck out. We're done." And he's like, "No, you will stay there until you hit the ball." And he just made me sit there like missing over and over and over and over again. And I was just crying because I was so humiliated. And this kid, he just comes out of line and the PE teacher's like, "Get back in line. She'll stay here." And then he was like, "Well, she's never gonna hit the ball if she doesn't even know how to hold a bat." And he comes up and he taught me how to hold a bat. And so it was just I was enamored with him and how nice he was. And I remember him being so smart. And then in 6th grade, there was another kid that I had a crush on. But again, I don't remember what he looked like. I don't remember that being at all important at all. It was that he was the kid. We had no walkers. We only had kids that got driven to school and kids that rode the bus because of where our school was located. It wasn't safe to walk because of busy roads. And so he was this kid that he did kindergarten duty, which are the kids, the 6th graders that went and took the kindergartners to the bus line and played with them until the buses got there. So he was just this really nice he was the kindergarten duty kid, right? And so I remember being so just in love with who he was, but he was not it wasn't about what he looked like at all. And even if I had crushes on fictional characters, I did not have crushes on movie stars at all, but I would have crushes on book characters, you know, who obviously don't have bodies, right? um, and at the time, I didn't realize that. I mean, I sometimes like in young women's, I mean, my age, right? I remember girls being into like Tom Welling and Ryan Gosling, like Channing Tatum, all that sort of stuff. And I just was like, what? Why? You don't even know him. At the time, I didn't understand, you know, how you could be. attracted to someone that you had never met. Um, and then I started to really realize that I was different in high school. So I remember in high school, I had a boyfriend who um, he is a great person. I've talked to him since. He's married, has a kid. Really just great guy. But I remember in Seattle, it snows occasionally, but doesn't snow a lot. Um, and so it was snowing, and we were watching the snow on my parents' front porch, and we were just sitting there. And I remember just feeling the moment was getting a little romantic. And I look over at him and I have this thought of, I think he's going to try to kiss me. And the next thought was, I do not want that. And then I was thinking, why? I really like him. I think I even love him. But why can I think of very little else that I'd want to do less than kiss him? I don't want to kiss him. Ew, yuck. That sounds wet. That sounds gross. Why? And he didn't. I think he maybe sensed it a little bit. Many years later, I told him that I was asexual, and his response was, "Things make sense now."
That's funny.
but but I remember just being like, "Okay, everyone tells me about how great kissing is. Why don't I want it?" And I remember I had a really great young women's leaders. And the chastity lessons, they did a very good job of not making it shaming. They did a really, really good job of that. And they emphasized, that sexuality is beautiful, that it's divine, that it is God given, that your desire to be with somebody is God given. But that because it's so sacred, it needs to be in a sacred context of marriage, which is a gorgeous way to teach it. I'm now a young women's president, and I remember how like amazing it was they taught it that way. But because of me, and they couldn't have known this, I came out of those lessons going, then why don't I? Am I not divine? Am I not a daughter of God that I don't feel these things? And when I was a my maid, I went, oh, well, I guess God blessed me that I'm not tempted by this, right? This must be something God blessed me with, that I'm not at all tempted. And I remember being sometimes like, why do we keep talking about this? Like, okay, don't have sex before marriage. The end, like, um, and then when I was a Laurel, I started to feel, why don't I feel like that? And it really was this feeling of, am I not divine? And I remember, just as a silly little thing, that I wanted to get married, but I was just one I really didn't get is why when you got married did that mean you had to share a bed? And that felt completely unfair that you'd grow up and then had to share a bed with somebody else. That was like, what why would you want to share a bed with somebody? One of the best things in life is getting your own bed, right? And so there's these things that I was just like, why? You know, and then I got to college, and I think it was that moment that I realized I am different. When I was in college at BYU, I lived in Helaman Halls. So for those who don't know Helaman Halls, there are all these little rooms. There's two people in a room, and then there's a shared shower and bathroom for a hall of, I think there were probably 20 or so rooms. Um, and so, you'd hang out with everybody on your floor, and you're all good friends. And I remember one day we were just talking about, you know, cute guys or this or that. And somebody had said, oh, he's hot. And I said, I don't get that. Why do we say somebody's hot? Like, you can say they're pretty, you can say they're handsome, you can say they're attractive. Why do you say they're hot? And they all just turned and looked at me and said, because you feel hot.
Hmm.
And I was, wait, you do? You physically feel hot? And they all looked at me, yes. And I was realized I don't. I I don't know what that means. And I didn't say anything at that time, right? Um, but I realized I'm different. And I went home for the summer, and my siblings and I were watching this old silly movie, Far and Away. It's got Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. And in that, there's this scene where they're being these, you know, like turn of the century immigrants or something, and they break into somebody's house and pretend that they live there and like eat dinner together. And it's supposed to be this romantic thing. And it's kind of a weird scene. But my siblings were saying, this is such a weird scene. And I said, well, I mean, on one level, but haven't you ever just fantasized about making dinner with the person you love someday? And they just went, no. And I started to feel seen though in my, not seen, but oh, this is different. When I was a freshman at BYU. So at BYU, you have to take a letters credit, which is a literature credit of some kind. And just because I took Russian literature, so Russian novels. And I'm sure it's no surprise that in this course we read Anna Karenina or Anna Karenina, however you want to say it. And in that book, there are multiple couples that kind of analyze different types of relationships. So you have the main character, Anna, and her flame, Vronsky, who have this torrid affair, run off to Italy, and, you know, all that sort of stuff. And then there's another couple that aren't the main couple, but they're named Katya and Levin. And they have just a beautiful relationship. They get married and they have just special relationship. And there is one scene where Katya and Levin are trying to find a moment to be together in their just busy, busy married life. And they're running from room to room, and there's servants in that room, and there's somebody else in that room, and they eventually end up in the garden just to be able to have a moment together. And my professor was talking about this scene, who I'll say his name because he was one of the best professors I had, was Dr. Kelly at BYU. He was talking about how if you have a pure marriage, you can be just as in love when you're washing the dishes as you are in Italy. And that was my moment of realizing it's like, yeah, I want a relationship where you're in love washing the dishes. And so I had this, okay, so maybe that's real. Maybe it's not all about, you know, running off to Italy in a torrid affair. And I was talking one summer between semesters to my younger brother, who he is about just under 3 years younger than me, but we're very, very close. And I don't even remember how we got there, but we're very close. And we were just talking, and I remember just in context, I don't remember why, but I just remember saying, I don't ever want to have a sex with a man. I don't want to. It That sounds awful. It sounds frankly a little painful because like I'd never done it before. I was like, it sounds awful. And then he looks at me and says, yeah, that's because you're asexual. And I was like, what? What does that mean? He said, oh, this is, you know, people that don't, they're not attracted. And as he explained it to me, I just had this like,
Wow.
yeah, where have you heard that? Like, he says, it's a thing, you know, like some people are. And so that was my moment, like, yeah, I'm asexual. That's who I am. And the more I learned about it, you know, that you can still be romantically attracted. You can still want marriage. You can still want children. You can still want romantic relationships, but still be asexual. That was just crazy to me. And I'm not, I just want to clarify, not all asexual people do want children, not all asexual people do want marriage, but those things aren't mutually exclusive, that they're, you know, they can coexist. But then it got to this, where does that put me? Because, in my mind as a 20, 21-year-old woman, marriage meant sex, and I didn't want that. So, what is, and I knew, I'd been taught that marriage was essential, that it's the new and everlasting covenant. You know, you have to get married. That's how you get exalted. You have to. And I, at one point, was engaged to someone who's not my husband. Um, and, he knew I was asexual. He said he was okay with it. Turned out he wasn't. And, maybe he thought he was. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. It might have been he thought he was okay with it. But then as we got closer to the marriage, he realized he wasn't, which is totally fair. Um, and he's now married to someone who is a much better fit for him in many, many ways. So it's great. But, um, but I remember, you know, when I was engaged, not only was there this spiritual expectation of marriage, but when I was engaged, I realized that I was feeling even a little bit of access to that higher level of culture in the Latter day Saint culture, that married people are treated differently than single people.
Mm.
And I felt that even though I wasn't married, I was engaged. And so I felt a little taste of the change of respect that I
Mm.
got when I was on the cusp of being a married person. And I remember, after my engagement was called off, I that taste was gone and I got kind of bitter. And I remember one day, like, I disagreed with my dad and stuff. I was like, well, why are you treating me like I'm incomplete just because I'm not married? Why do I get treated like I'm incomplete? And, in the heat of the moment, he says, well, you kind of are incomplete. Like, you have to be married. Like, that's, you need to get married at some point. And, you know, and I said, well, you wouldn't have called me incomplete when I was 14 and not married. You wouldn't have called me incomplete when I was 17. You probably wouldn't even called me incomplete when I was 19 and not married. But now that I'm 23 and not married, so like at what point, where was the cutoff? When did I lose part of my being? you know? Um, and and I think we both had a moment of understanding it, because I think he understood what I was saying. But I also realized on some level he was a little right, right? I was not an incomplete person, but I was an incomplete eternal being, that Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother are one, that they are feminine and masculine, creating godhood. And so at some point, even if it wasn't this life, I would be a feminine with no masculine. And so I was like, okay, so I need to think about that. And I became okay with the idea that I wouldn't marry in this life. That was okay to me. I was sad that I wouldn't be a mother in this life. But I told myself, well, I mean, maybe someday I'll just get lots of foster kids. And even though this is me as a 22-year-old with incomplete understanding, but I was like, even though the proclamation says that they're entitled to a father and a mother, if I take kids that don't have any family at all, like, a mother's better than nothing, right? So, I'll just be this foster mother with all these little kids. It'll be fine. And then at one point I even hatched this plan, because, it was 20 2010 to 2015. So there was a lot of stuff about, the church and homosexuality, and where people fit in that. So I hatched this plan that I was going to find some man that wanted to be a faithful member of the church but was gay. And so I'd tell him, like, look, we don't have to be intimate. We'll just be married, and and we'll just be married together, and it'll be great. um, I even, like, if my joking, one of my favorite prophets is Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah 16, Jeremiah is told not to marry, um, because of the pain that he will see in his life to not take a wife. And so I would tell people, I was like, well, you know what? Jeremiah's still single. I've got a chance in the eternity was how I would joke with people. Um, but I remember it was just crushing to just feel, but you're gonna live your entire life less and not accepted. And I remember talking to bishops about it, and I would get, I mean, situations where it's, and they had no idea what asexuality is. Like in the past, they didn't know what it was. And I, get told, like, well, you just need to understand who you are as a daughter of God, or you just need to bend your will to the Father. It will happen. Or maybe you just haven't met him yet. Or, you know, very well intentioned things that it's, they were men. They were men trying to serve God, and um but I remember one day when I was working, um, I worked night shift and I was working in Salt Lake City. And I was a lab scientist and I had a lab assistant who was raised in the church, but one of the laboratory assistants, he was raised in the church, but he had left the church actually because of LGBTQ. Um, and I remember one night just being like, I just don't belong. Like maybe I just need to leave the church. I don't belong. And he looked at me and he said, Hannah, where would you go? You are, you believe it. And you know that you believe it. And you know that you are a Mormon girl. Where would you go? And I was telling my mom this, and my mom at the time was a seminary teacher in upstate New York. And she was teaching New Testament. She says, yeah, it's like when Christ asked the apostles, will you also leave me? And their response is, to whom would we go? And it was, yeah, I don't have anywhere else that is true. So I guess I'm staying here. And I decided to, um, go move to Cincinnati, go get my PhD, and just be like, well, I'll stay in the church and someday I'll marry Jeremiah. That was just my, my little, I'll marry Jeremiah. Why not? Um, and unbeknownst to me in Cincinnati on one Sunday, there was a guy there in my ward. I always went to family wards after BYU. I didn't want to go to singles wards. um, and my husband had gone to law school in Cincinnati, but he had graduated and he moved out of state. But he was back in Cincinnati for the weekend visiting some friends. And we got introduced that Sunday, and then and we decided, like, hey, let's try it out. It was a Sunday and he had to go back to his job, So I said, well, why don't you come to my apartment and we can have dinner and maybe watch a movie or something. And so after church that evening, I made him dinner, and I have permission to tell this story. So we were watching, I think we were watching Ender's Game. I don't know. Um, and I am a very dry person. Like my skin is dry, my lips are dry. Like I'm a dry person. And so I put on chapstick constantly. But he misread the signal of me getting chapstick out of my pocket and putting it on my lips that I wanted him to kiss me. So he goes for it. And I remember just like pulling back, and I remember you giving some sort of like, I'm really enjoying this date and I don't want to ruin a good thing. So like, let's not go too fast or whatever. And he did not get it and was like, what do you like? We're not doing anything wrong. Like it's fine, you know. And I was like, no, I don't want to. So then he's like, okay. So then we didn't. And I remember we went on a few more dates. And then I think it was like third or fourth date that He called me, he's like, "Hey, you wanna hang out?" And I was like, "Sure, I guess." Because he'd always tried to kiss me on these dates, right? And so then he comes over, and then I was like, "Okay, so here's the thing. We can hang out, we can talk, but I don't wanna kiss." And I told him, I was like, "I'm asexual." I told him what that meant, and I said, "And if you want to leave, like, if you're not interested in this relationship anymore, like, no hard feelings, quite honestly. Like, I get it, you know, if that's not what you're in for, you know, I I understand." But he said, No, I think I still want to stay." And he says, "And we won't kiss." And, he asked me to marry him eventually, not that day. Um, but a few months later, he asked me to marry him. And I said, "Yeah, but I'm still asexual." And he said, "Yeah, I know." Um, he says, "I think I still want to marry you." And I remember, harkening back to the bed thing, right? My siblings made fun of me so much that I was like, "I don't want to share a bed with my husband." They were like, "Well, that's kind of like, you kind of have to." And I remember we were engaged one day and I kind of sheepishly told him, I was like, "You know what? I don't really want to share a bed." And he just said, "That's okay." I was like, he says, "Can we share a room?"
Oh,
And I said, "Yeah." So my husband and I have two twin beds. I love Lucy style in the same room. And I remember he told me, "Yeah, we can do that." And I just leapt up and threw my arms around him and hugged him and just went,
wow.
and it was just so exciting that he was like, "Yeah, we can, we don't have to share a bed. That's fine." And it turns out that, when people complain about, how much their wives toss and turn when they're pregnant, he's just like, "Can't relate. I don't share a bed with her." Um, he's a really light sleeper and I don't like to be touched. It worked out lovely anyway. Um, but then I just remember before the ceiling. And so, like, I was older and, so I had already been endowed. And so, we had to do a veil separately. And so I remember I'm getting dressed. And so we got married in the Columbus Temple, which is a smaller temple. So it doesn't have a bride's room. So it's the matron's office that you get ready in. And so my mom was helping me get into my dress. And I was just all of a sudden started bawling. And I was like, "Mom, I don't know if I want to do this. I don't know. I don't know if I want to do this." And my mom says, "Well, you don't have to. We can stop." And I'm like, "Well, I don't want to like tell him and his family." And my mom says, "If you don't want to do this, I can go out there right now and say she's not doing this. The wedding's off. No, you can't talk to her today. Go home." And when she gave me that option, I just said, "No, I don't want to do that." And she's like, "Are you sure?" And she says, and I was like, "Yeah, I don't want to do that. I'm doing this." Um, and so we do the veil thing, and the temple president, is there in the celestial room. And he says, "You guys just take a moment to talk to each other before you go into the sealing room." And I just remember telling him, like, "This is your last chance. You know, do you really want to marry an asexual girl?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "I don't know when I want to have sex with you. I don't know that I will. I don't know if I'll ever want to." And then he said, "Even if we never have sex, I want to marry you." And the strange thing is that when he said that and realizing that this marriage wasn't at all about that, that's when the possibility of someday having sex was opened to me. To know that I didn't have to, was when it became possible to me. And then he, kind of, I mean, it seems silly now that this is putting his money where his mouth is. The sealer came in to be like, "Are you ready?" And and one of the things he said is, he said, "I always ask. Some couples want to kiss across the altar, and others don't. Do you want to do that?" And I didn't respond. He just looks at them and he says, "No, she doesn't." And to me, that was him saying, "We're good. You don't have to." And did it happen on the wedding night? No, it didn't happen for several months. It did eventually. I'm not going to go into the gory details, but one day I was like, no, I want to try it. And I think that's also one of the things. I don't want to say that, like, I wish everyone could be asexual, but in some days, I wish that everyone could experience a relationship like my husband and I have, because it is so based on communication and consent. And my husband is not asexual. And that has been hard for him some days, to know that I am not attracted to him. And he's been honest that it is hard as a man to know that you do not and cannot pleasure your wife. And we have gotten to know my body. Let's just, physiologically, I'm still a human. So, sexual pleasure can happen if it's physiological. Um, but we've gotten to know how to make it, if not pleasurable for me, like at least not terrible for me. But there is so much consent. Anything that happens in the bedroom is coupled with consent and absolute respect for both of us to be able to say no and stop. And that's not what I wanted. And that's not what I like. And for both of us to have that level of just respect for one another. There is no assumption in that regard for us. And I think that's beautiful. Um, but at the same time, like, I mean, we've been through not long periods of unemployment, but we've had, times when somebody has lost their job. We've been through a miscarriage at one point. Like, we've been through some hard things. But I think asexuality is simultaneously the most beautiful and most difficult part of our marriage. Um, but it is so wonderful to be in love with someone romantically, and that everything is lovely in that way. Um, and then I kind of thought of, like, what are the things that I would want people to know? That you're not broken if you don't feel that. Um, that you are still divine, and that you're just different. And different's not bad. It's just different. There's no value judgment to different. It's not good or bad. It's just different. Um, I want people to know that mixed orientation is possible. Um, and I don't want to, I, I don't want to pressure anyone, especially people that are same sex attracted. And I know it can be very painful for people to say, like, well, mixed orientation is okay. Uh, and I don't want people to feel pressured to be in a mixed orientation relationship, but it is very much so possible if that's what you want. Um, and that there isn't one way to navigate this. There's just people and what you want to do. Um, and then the last one, and as I was preparing for this, I talked to my husband about, you know, what we did want me to share, what we didn't want me to share. And the one thing that he wanted me to share, and I think he's right. In the asexual community, there is sometimes assumptions that if you don't want sex, you can't consent to it. And so there are people in the asexual community who would believe that my husband is abusive by definition.
Mm,
And that's not true. They ask me, if you don't want sex, how do you have children? And the way I describe it is you can want to give somebody something that you didn't want. And so for me, I take pleasure knowing that he's pleasured. And the way, like, my analogy for this is my husband does not like classical music or opera or Shakespeare or anything like that. I love them. I love classical music so much. I love Shakespeare. He does not. He finds them absolutely boring. Like boring to the point of painful. And one time we went to a production of Winter's Tale, and in my mind I'm thinking, "Oh my goodness, this is the moment he's going to go to Shakespeare and he's going to realize it's awesome." And so we go to this play, and afterwards I'm so excited. She's like, "Well, what did you think?" And he goes, "It was fine." And I'm just like, "No, but what did you think? Like, did you like it?" I'm waiting for him to like, "Oh my goodness, yes, it is. I was wrong. Shakespeare's amazing." Um, and he just goes, "It makes me happy to see you happy." And I said, "But didn't you like it?" He says, "Not really, but it makes me happy to see you happy." "Well, would you go to Shakespeare again?" Maybe I'd take you to Shakespeare again because it makes you happy, but I wouldn't go on my own. And that's how I feel about sex with him at this point. Do I like it? No. Do I like that he likes it, that he loves it? Yes. On top of that, I don't, people that are asexual, we call them allosexual. I don't understand this, but allosexual people seem to put sex up there with like food and water and sleep and necessary like human experiences. I don't get it, but I know that they do. And so I don't know if I could tell somebody, I love you, but I don't want you to have this very base level fulfillment that you crave. um, so it's completely consensual for us. And kind of related to that is I want people to not know they're not alone, but at the same time, if other people don't get it, that's okay. You know, and if somebody, calls my husband nasty names, I just say, "You know what? I really don't like that you just called the person that I've considered my life companion that. Please don't say that about him." But that's all there is. And then the last thing that I want to make sure I say is someday my daughters are going to be old enough to understand this. And they've already asked, my 5-year-old has asked me, "Why do so and so's parents have one bed, but you and daddy have two?"
mm.
And I just tell her, because mommy and daddy like sleeping in their own beds. That's all that she needs to know at this point. But someday they will know. And so I want them to know your parents don't love each other any less, because someday they'll know, that their mother is asexual. And I want them to know that that doesn't mean that I love their father any less or that their father loves me any less, because it's just a different love. And that's my big thing, is it's just different. That's all.
And on behalf of all our listeners, thanks for being so honest, so vulnerable, so factual, so real. I'm just, I'm overcome sometimes with the courage of our guests to talk about really tender subjects out of love for others that are walking this road. Um, I learned so much. um, I've done enough of these podcasts that sometimes I just get new insights into a current concept, but you taught me things I've never considered before, really helpful. Um,
Mm.
Listeners, Hannah never looked down in shame the whole podcast when she was talking about some of these tender things about being asexual, not feeling hot at Helaman Halls. Um, and I just think that's an insight to where you are as a daughter of heavenly parents and your own spiritual journey and your own acceptance of being asexual. There's no shame. And that's one of the things we're trying to do in these stories is de-shame people that are sexual minorities, gender minorities, and feel like,
Yeah.
you wrote this line that how can I be divine because I don't have sexual attraction? So this is you taking us to your younger self. I would never have thought that a young woman or a young man could feel that way, but that's pretty logical when you talk about that. And then the shame, and you think, God doesn't love me. He's created me in a way that's not acceptable to him. What have I done wrong? And what do I need to
Yes.
undo? And so that can lead to lots of inner looking. That's not a word, listeners, but that's not helpful. So I think we talked about this a little before we went live, but I can't remember, listeners, because I'm getting too old. You talked, and maybe this you did cover this, but you talk you separate romantic attraction from sexual
Yes.
attraction. You talked, I think before we live, some people that are asexual don't have the romantic attraction, but you do.
Hmm.
Um, and so,
Yeah.
how did, I guess the question is, when did you know that romantic attraction was part of you and you would be romantically attracted to your husband?
That's a good question. I mean, I think even before I knew that there was a term for, romantic attraction, in my mind, I called it that I wanted the companionship of marriage. Like if people would say, "Do you want to be married?" I would say, "I like the companionship of the idea of marriage." And I fantasized, like I said, about washing dishes. I fantasized about, working alongside a husband. Um, but I think it was just even really, really young. If I was attracted to a boy, it was completely, it was non-sexual, it was non-physical, it was completely emotional. And um and then later I learned that, this is a common experience of asexual people to have that romantic attraction without the sexual attraction. But I think it was just for a long time. And I mean, for a while because I think there was a time when I tried to convince myself that I didn't want that. And I think it was that I didn't realize that those are different things. And I think that a lot of people, because like I said, they match, you know, most straight people, most heterosexual people are also heteroromantic, most homoromantic people or homosexual people are also homoromantic. I, you know, I assumed that they had to be the same. So if I was asexual, I also had to be aromantic, but I don't, you know. Um, but I think, yeah, because I think, yeah. And I don't remember if it was before or after recording, but the point that I talked about that people have asked me like, well, maybe you're actually pan romantic, which is, the gender of it's not important, but just because of your cultural upbringing, you're hetero-romantic. And that's possible, the idea that when I was growing up, I was taught to want marriage and that fulfilled the idea of romantic, but you know, growing up, that was just okay, therefore it will be a man that you make this romantic relationship with. And it's possible. But I mean, I'm happy with my husband. Can I say his name?
Yeah, please.
Okay, yeah. So my husband, I'm happy with John. My husband's name is John. So I'm happy with John. So, you know, whether or not I'm actually pan romantic,
I love that.
irrelevant, I guess, at this point.
This is a beautiful love story with you and John. Listeners, Don't do what I would have done 10 years ago, because I would have, whenever I heard a gender minority or sexual minority, I probably might have thought that's really a straight person that's been confused in some way. So I might have said something like this. I'm sorry if anybody said this to you, Hannah, but I'm doing this just to kind of repent. I might have said, well, our culture, you know, sort of talks about how men are sexual beings and women aren't sometimes. And so you've
Mm.
just been repressed. You're
Mm.
actually a
Yes.
heterosexual, but you've been told not to be sexually active. You've been told the boys are out of control. You've never sort of talked in our
Mhm.
culture about, and it sounds like you gave big shout outs to young women leaders to not teach that way, that you are sexual
Yes.
beings. So I don't know if anybody said that to you and what, because you are asexual and this is a thing and it's not a
Yeah.
bad thing. I don't, my feeling now is that this is how our heavenly parents created you and they're not disappointed in you. They don't feel like something went wrong. This is who you are and it's a good thing. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Oh, yeah. So there are, we call them the common responses. Um, Asexuals, and there'll even be, on online communities, lists of pithy responses to all of the common ones. And one of them is, like, we're just repressed.
Yeah.
Um, to take that even further, a common one was, well, were you raped?
Yeah. That's probably good. Yeah.
That it's repression to a sexual response, a sexual assault response, um, which um, there are people who have repressed sexual attraction as a defense mechanism against sexual assault. And in the purest way, um, that's not truly asexuality because it's a sexual orientation, right? But we accept those people in the asexual community as well. And
It's
so,
awesome.
I just want to put that shout out there. Like, if you're more comfortable with us, come on in. I mean, I can't speak for all asexuals, but as a community, we're not very gatekeepy. If you want to call yourself asexual, come on in. But it's it, you know, the fact that I have never ever at any point in my life looked at a man, even my own husband, and said, "Hey, let's go." Never. It's But that is a common thing that gets said. Another common one we get told is like, "Well, have you got your hormones checked?"
Yeah.
Um, and um, I asked my gynecologist once when somebody's like, "Well, you should get your hormones checked." I asked a gynecologist, I was like, "Should I get my hormones checked?" And her response was, "Well, you have had periods your entire life that are normally spaced. You have gotten pregnant multiple times without any trouble.
Mm,
You have carried 3 children to term with no problems. The only one that you didn't carry to term, we had another reason that we knew why that had nothing to do with you hormonally. You've breastfed 3 children.
mm,
You're hormonally female." And there's nothing wrong for those that do struggle with hormone or female problems. That's not what I want to relay, but
right.
that someone can be very clearly anatomically and physiologically male or female and still be asexual. But um it's and on top of that, I think it is a fair question also that men versus women, asexuality is very rare, but most are female. Um I kind of think that there's even more pressure on men to, like you said, be sexual. And so I suspect this might be a sampling error, that there are more men that are asexual, but for cultural reasons, they don't feel comfortable admitting that to themselves. Um, And why does it, I'm sorry, this isn't exactly the same thing, but I just want to say this as well. Um, Sometimes people say, why does it matter? Like, no one's making you have sex, so why does it matter if you don't want to? And I'm not gonna, they say like, especially compared to the rest of the LGBTQ community that has experienced hate and violence and all of these things. I mean, there are even members of the LGBT community that don't think asexuals belong in the LGBTQ community, because they haven't experienced that same level of violence. Um, and to that, I will say, for one, some asexuals consider themselves LGBTQ, some don't, some consider themselves queer, and some people don't even use those labels because they don't feel that any of them really describe them. For me, if I had to choose, I'd say I'm straight, probably because I'm what's called straight passing. So if, I don't want to get into it and somebody's like, which are you? But asexuals would call me straight passing because I'm married to a man. I have biological children. So if somebody doesn't know, they'd assume I'm straight. Um, but the most common thing that asexuals experience, um, even though they don't necessarily experience, people burning their houses down or things like that. Um, Asexuals, luckily not myself, but many asexuals have experienced what's called corrective rape, which is people who will try to force them
Wow.
in order to convince them, yes, you are.
Wow.
I can fix you. That's one of the other ones that we have our pithy responses to: give me one night, I can fix you,
It's terrible.
which is horrible. um, so those types of things, that it's just, that's, I think, where we need that understanding that we don't need fixing, for one. For two, um, it's okay. You know, um, our pithy one that people use now, it's we have all the responses for people that are being rude. And I try to emphasize to people, it's like, let's use the nice ones before we use the rude ones. Uh, but if someone keeps going, sometimes you just have to be like, yeah, sorry. No, that's not okay. But I think you've just repressed it. I answered that question all over
No,
the place, but it
actually, it
made me
was
think
really
of
good.
several things.
And so this is
But
part of the podcast
the
we
repressed
love.
one, if someone says you're just repressed, my response to that is, so how do you know that you're not, if that person is straight, how do you know you're not gay? Maybe you just repressed it. And then I think usually in their brains they just go, "Oh yeah, no, I don't think that's true." you know.
I think that's very helpful, Hannah. You give a lot of grace to people, to write their own stories within this asexual broad umbrella. It's a little different than you. And I think that's a sign of just maturity and grace and
Yeah.
understanding. I was with my son listeners on a vacation, just the two of us. We really haven't done that. He's in his 20s and went and joined him for a few days. And he framed something up for me that was really helpful. He says, we've got these stories. Um, and then sometimes we hear a story, and if we're humble and open and teachable, and that's harder as we get older, we're willing to adjust our story for new information. So in this space, my 10-year-old younger self would have had a story about asexual people, gay people, trans people. And, I'm trying to adjust my story as I hear more information. And that's part of, I think, listeners creating Zion and just being willing to open and learn. There were a couple just beautiful moments of this podcast. Your mom in the bride's room before the wedding,
Mm.
that was a
Yeah.
parenting home run. And I got really tenderhearted for that she gave you full permission to do whatever you wanted to do there. And that she would even do the hard part of walking out. Um, and I've been at temple worker, and we've sent groom. Of course, I don't work the women's room, but the men go up, and once in a while they come down unmarried, and that didn't happen in your case, but I'm aware
Sure.
of the complexity of that. But I love your mom giving you space to totally own that decision with no agenda,
Yeah.
and she would take all the effort that it would need to take that this wedding is being called off. I also love your husband and some of the things that he did that just helped me understand his character. Um, we can sleep in two twin beds. There's a principle there about communication and about trust. You talk about your marriage is based on communication and consent. And I love that.
Yeah.
I As a why I say bishop, we'd see some of these couples, and sometimes we're the only thing that was getting at the temple was just wanting to keep the law of chastity and having hormones, and they hadn't developed the foundation. And a lot of that came. I was probably like that as a young married couple, and the
Yeah.
communication kind of built in. But there's something about your story that's really helpful just to build these fundamental blocks as much as you can before you're married, and develop these tools of really vulnerable, open communication. So you were really vulnerable because you like this guy, and you've had an engagement go south as you opened up about being asexual. So I'm not a therapist, but there's a part of me that would intuitively recognize this is a wounding experience for you to potentially open your heart to another guy and another
Yeah.
relationship, and knowing this is a thing. You can't undo this thing, and it's not needing to be undone. And so for him to respond that way, and you have the courage to just communicate this, that's part of one of your parts of one of what you're helping is other people that are navigating this. These are have better tools to do that because you just were upfront about who you are,
Yeah.
and then you pivot to, I'm romantically attracted. I think hetero romantic is the term you're using, and you're
Mhm.
building a marriage, a really wonderful, authentic. One of the things I've also tried to do, listeners, is not when I first became aware of mixed orientation marriages earlier in becoming an ally, where one or two aren't straight. I think I had a tendency to elevate one over the other, and you're the hero and you're doing the harder thing. And now my current self is saying, I'm not trying to, it's not my job to look at a marriage and say who's the hero and who's doing the harder thing.
Yeah.
That's not where I should be spending my mental energy. I should just be spending my mental energy of loving a couple and not trying to figure out the backstory of how this all works, even though you're bravely sharing some of that, which I think is appropriate and helps others. But so that's kind of one of the things I'm trying to do. Um, Tell me this, because some might think, well, and I'm sorry to bring back these things you've probably had to deal with. Well, Hannah, you're on your road to being gay because you've figured out you're not attracted to men. So obviously you're attracted to women and you're gay and you just haven't quite got there yet. And I'm, this being asexual is a thing, listeners. So I'm not trying to say that. I'm just trying to,
Sure.
if people are thinking that about asexual people in their circle or about themselves, and I'm really on my road to being homosexual with my orientation, talk a little bit about that. I think you kind of addressed that without talking specifically about that one.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, I think that there have been several situations where prominent coming out stories in the media take take a layover in asexual land, right? Where they say, "Well, I'm not straight. I guess I'm asexual," you know. Um so I can get why people might think that, but and I mean this doesn't answer it on a cerebral level, but even before I was married, the thought of having sex with a woman was even less appealing than the thought of having sex with a man.
That's probably pretty good indicator you're not
Yeah.
sexually attracted
And
to
maybe
women.
again, maybe that's cultural because I was like, I wanted children. So having sex with a man maybe was like, I could see it as a means to an end. I don't know. But there was never a time when I was like, but I could go with a woman. That would work. There was never that time for me. Um, And I know that there are some asexual people that that's different, like we say asexuality is a spectrum. And if it's a spectrum, if you have everything from straight to fully asexual, you also have people who are on you know, the lesbian or the gay side of asexual. It's, so I'd be like, I don't like men, but I could see a world with a man and I live in that world. And there are some people who say I'm asexual, but I could see a world as a lesbian or something like that. But for me, they're completely different. It's And I think it's also often tied to your romanticism. So if someone is homo romantic, they could probably entertain homosexuality more than they could entertain heterosexuality. So since I'm hetero romantic, I can entertain a heterosexual marriage more than I can entertain a homosexual one. But no, there definitely is that response as well. That it's just the gate drug, you know.
Just a really thoughtful answer. Um, I also wanted to. There's a kind of a sub story in here about being a single Latter Day Saint woman, getting on with your career, and um,
Yeah, there is.
I remember, back to my YSA assignment. My wife really helped me, but we wanted the YSAs to feel complete now. And because they're
Mm,
children of heavenly parents and because of their divine nature, and that's part of our doctrine. And it didn't take personal progress off the table. It didn't take their desire to get married, but we just wanted them to feel like they were whole and complete now and not some future event like marriage that often is
yeah,
outside of their control. And sounds like you navigate a little bit of that, but I guess part of my question is getting a PhD as an unmarried Latter day Saint woman. Did you get headwinds around that? Like, well, Hannah, you ought to sort of like stick around or not, that's going to scare guys off or quit following that kind of dream because
yeah,
you need to kind of, and so there's a story in here, maybe talking to younger Latter day Saint women that are unmarried that have
yeah,
these dreams. I mean, what you've done from an academic standpoint is remarkable. That's not a simple, I don't think there's any simple PhD, but that's a PhD, at least out of my expertise, that be really intense. But
yeah,
just talk to younger Latter day Saint women who are trying to figure out how to navigate their hopes and dreams professionally and being single. That's a whole nother
yeah.
podcast, but maybe you
No,
give us a
but
couple
it's
thoughts.
it's a really good question, and a really good thought. And I think, and I got people who thought that moving to Ohio
Yeah.
to go get a PhD was me just admitting defeat on the
Whoa.
marriage front.
That's a
That
great,
it was just, like, well,
that's
that's not happening. Guess I'm gonna go do something else. Um, and I think for me, one of the biggest things is, like you said, realizing that you are whole. And I think another part of that was admitting at the same time that I wasn't, but nobody was. So you are a whole human being, even when you're single. So, like I said, I realized I would need to get married at some point in eternity to continue to move forward, to continue to grow. Marriage was necessary at some point, right? But that did not have to be now. And it didn't need to be in this life because we all are incomplete. Obviously, we're not resurrected, perfected beings. So we are all pending people, right? We are all s- sons and daughters of God in construction, right? And so it was kind of a realization that, you know, I can go and live my life and um do things to contribute to this world and to develop myself and to further myself. And if marriage happened, it would happen. And it did, right? But if it didn't, that was fine because even the married people weren't complete. Right? Nobody is. We're all in development. So, but you are a whole person. And, since having children, I look at my daughter who is 10 months now. And I'd had this idea, for all of my children, but it was with her when she was like 3 months old. And I looked down at her. I think I was breastfeeding her at the time. And I looked down at her, this little 3-month old who can't roll over, can smile, but can't talk, can't take herself to the bathroom, can't walk, can't really do much of anything. And the realization that she is an adult spirit in a baby body, that 3 months ago, she was a spirit in heaven. And that's wild to think about, right? That we're all adult spirits that come here and we're learning to get to the next level. So there's not any specific time that we will be complete on this earth. We won't, but we're whole. And that's different. Complete and whole are not the same thing. It was the same time, my husband is, so I was married when I was 27, and my husband is 5.5 years older than I am. And so he was at a stage where he was basically considered a lost cause, right? Um, and he says, and I agree with this, that he had to get to the point in his life where he realized that he could not be happy in a marriage until he was happy by himself.
Hmm.
That happiness would not be created by marriage.
Wow.
Two unhappy people don't make a happy couple. And so if you're, if you're not married and you want to be, or even if that's not where your brain is right now, just go be a happy person because you're a whole person. You may not be a complete eternal spirit, and that's fine. Nobody is, but you're a whole person, if that answers your
It does.
question.
You are really good at some really insightful nuggets. Even that advice you gave at the end. I love that just some other things I wrote down, listeners, as we're coming to a close, is I love just you being age appropriate with your daughter about we're in two different beds and just gave an age appropriate answer and she moved
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
And I think because you're so good at communication within your marriage, I think you'll just be able, and sense, yeah, I think you said this, I'll at some point explain my asexual to my daughters, and I think they'll just go, oh, that's mine. Just because they're used to these kind of conversations. There's probably no taboo subjects or nothing they're going to feel shame about asking mom or dad. And I think that's part of just creating a great family culture. So some would say, well, don't talk about this publicly. And I think you've done a great job of saying why this is appropriate to talk about publicly in the right situation.
Yeah,
And my goal is to just help other couples. I love that you're a young
absolutely.
women's president. You just kind of casually mentioned that, but
Yeah.
I would guess you can handle the subjects the young women want to talk about. And I think you're a great role model in all
Thank
aspects
you.
of your story. They're all beautiful parts of your story. And I'm grateful for that the young women have you. I liked you touching on men that are asexual. You kind of have answered some questions in advance that I didn't ask, but I thought about that a little bit. And there's probably is more shame around men being asexual. And so I hope if you're an asexual man that this podcast has helped you. The same principles apply. So I think it was really very helpful. One of the things that I think John has done and both of you have done is this is back to the single discussion is I had a checklist, listeners. I had Excel spreadsheets had just been invented when I was dating. That ages me. And so I would put it on an Excel spreadsheet and had this checklist. And then I dated a divorced woman, which wasn't on my checklist. It was kind of an unusual situation. I agree. And she blew my mind because I recognized the checklist was a mistake. The assumption was the checklist would get me to the kind of woman I wanted to marry. And And those checklist things like return missionary, never divorced, or probably I didn't have it on the checklist, but I assumed everybody was straight at BYU. Now I realize that's not true. um, so, but my point is, the checklists were trying to get me to the values I wanted in my future wife, which I did find. But I love that both of you have seemed to thrown out the checklists and
Yeah.
said, we're not, we are mature enough to get past the checklists and look at the values, look at the person, look at the character, look at our common goals. And so I think that's a mature way to approach dating. So if you're still in the checklist mode as a single Latter-day Saint, follow my example, throw out the checklist. It may keep you from dating someone that is your future eternal companion. And sometimes those
Mhm.
things like going through divorce actually refine somebody in a really positive, helpful way because the things they've learned, and it's not a negative thing. It's just part of mortality that helps us grow. Um, anything that's sort of, I got a list and I've checked everything off. Do you have anything else you'd like to share with our listeners, Hannah?
Mm. No, I don't think so. I think it's just, you know, we are there, and and if this is your, and it's kind of, it's hard to talk about, especially, you know, sometimes people will ask us. And my husband and I are pretty open about it. We are honest. We're like, there are some things is like, if you want to ask us this, like, just keep it to yourself. Like, things, mostly things is like, I'm not going to get into the inner workings of our bedroom life. That's not really anyone's business, right?
Agreed.
Um, but it's, you know, you're not alone. And if it's, if this is who you are, that's really fine. It's just different. That's kind of my
That's
takeaway. It's
great.
just different.
Um, I did write down Dr. House. It's a TV show, listeners, and I've just come out of shoulder surgery, so I've been watching these old. And
Yeah.
he's kind of this doc, as you probably know, that finds the diseases, these crazy diseases, and then solves them. But there was an episode about somebody who was asexual. Um, and maybe you're familiar with this episode. And his assumption was she's not asexual. If I can just figure
Mm-hmm.
out a physiological story here, she's actually not asexual, and she's married to a guy, and he's not asexual. And sure enough, I like
That's what it
them.
was.
That's what it was. I like them addressing the episode because I thought this is good. They're talking about this and normalizing talking about asexual. But I was uncomfortable that his conclusion turned to be true. These are
Mhm.
two people that aren't
Yeah.
asexual that are just, there's a backstory here. If I can just figure it out, I've really got two um, people that aren't asexual. So you're familiar with that episode, I guess, or the
It's
general
kind of
story.
a yeah, it's kind of infamous in the asexual community, actually,
Is that
because
storyline not?
we're always, well, no, I mean infamous in the sense that, like I said, we don't get a lot of media representation as asexual people. And if we do, they are villains, or it's not real.
Yeah,
Like they're just hormonally broken,
yeah.
or they're vampires. That's another one. Like they're vampires or they're
Wow,
undead. Like
wow.
that's another thing. Um, or that they are, a lot of times they are villains and they're cold and calculating, and maybe they'll have sex with people if it's to their best benefit, but they don't care. It's just like
Wow.
they're obsessed with money, they're obsessed with power. And so,
That's not good.
sometimes it's like, no, we can be very loving, affectionate people. We're just not
Well,
into sex.
if if you're a writer out there creating content, maybe you can create some better content and shift the narrative here.
I
Um,
hear Brandon Sanderson recently made a character. I haven't read that book yet, but I hear he recently made one.
representation matters and proximity matters.
Yeah.
So, thanks our listeners who listen to these stories and share these stories. Thanks, Hannah, for your courage to be on the podcast. You and John have a beautiful marriage, love story, and even though he wasn't on the podcast, I sense that you both talked about this and thought it was good to do. So it represents both of your story, and I'm grateful to both of you, um, especially you, Hannah, that are willing to share your story so others don't feel alone and we can help create Zion. Um,
Yeah.
so we will sign off. This is Hannah Russell
All right.
from Cincinnati, Ohio, and Richard also from Salt Lake City. And thanks for listening for another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.
Thanks.